This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Everyone knows on this podcast that I proudly speak about my time in Vietnam. What a wild ride. The first time that I ever stepped foot in Vietnam was 2013. And I must say, given the history with America, I was a little bit concerned. But at that point in time, there was something going on in my life, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to Vietnam. I'm going to land in Ho Chi Minh City. I'm going. The only place in my lifetime where I have been, where I knew nobody, I just showed up. And I have to tell you, one of the best decisions I ever made. Now, it would not be surprising that if I spend a little bit of time in Vietnam, somebody like me, I end up meeting interesting people. My guest today is Andy Ho. He's the Chief Investment Officer of VinaCapital, a multi-billion-dollar fund. Andy has a fantastic personal story about leaving Vietnam early as a child and coming back as an adult. He has a fantastic perspective. He also has a great new book out that helps people to understand the investing opportunities inside Vietnam. And I got to tell you, as crazy as it was for me just to come to Vietnam, at least for me it was at that point in time, it was crazy. Not crazy now. Now I look back at myself and I say, what were you afraid of? But what's also cool is the crazy way that you meet people in Vietnam, like meeting Andy. I met Andy because I gave a presentation in Hong Kong in 2018. A presentation in Hong Kong where at the end of that presentation, the vice chairman of VinaCapital, Terry Mahoney, walked up to me cold and just said, hey, I spend a lot of time in Vietnam. Terry introduced me to Andy. A few years later, Andy has a book out. I know Andy. And guess what? I knew it was a smart call to have Andy on this podcast. Without any further delay, without any further setup from me, let's jump right in with my guest today, Andy Ho of VinaCapital. So here's where I want to start. I want to start with you, Andy, and I want you to take me back in time. I want to kind of start as an origin story. And I want to start with you leaving Vietnam. I think that's 1977, correct?
Correct.
How old are you when you leave?
I left when I was 6 and I landed when I was 7.
Did you have any memory of leaving?
Just a little bit here and there, but obviously the adults that I was with, they gave me their memories, but not sure if it's accurate. As a kid, you get on a boat and you kind of enjoy the boat ride. You go to Malaysia and a refugee camp and you enjoy your time with other kids. And a few months later, you get sponsored to the United States. I suppose I was very fortunate as a young boy. It's just an enjoyable adventure.
Now, at that time, you had no Vietnamese and no English, correct?
I grew up in a Chinese family, so my first language was Cantonese. Most Chinese people in Vietnam speak Cantonese. The two adults that took me were my uncle and aunt. They obviously are Chinese as well. But I did learn quite quickly. Most of the people on the boat and the refugee camps were Vietnamese, so you can learn quite quickly. I had the fortunate thing of having a domino set. I had one possession that was very valuable, was a domino set. And I would rent it to people to play. And that's how I earned my little revenue.
Starting off young with that commerce mentality, right?
The very fortunate thing.
One of the things I love about Asian culture, Chinese culture, Vietnamese culture is that merchant thought process. I love that. It's great.
Sure. As long as someone pays you for it, right?
Well, yeah. Let me fast forward a little bit. You get to the States, you acclimate, you go through the process of getting all the degrees and MIT eventually and all that kind of fun stuff. And eventually you come back to Vietnam as a CPA. But before I get to Vietnam, is there any one experience for you growing up in the States? That's a pretty rocky start that most kids don't have to deal with that. Boats and going to a different country and all that kind of stuff. Is there one experience, whether in your teens or your 20s, that really shaped you? Something that maybe I'm fishing here. I don't even know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for some one thing that really shaped you before you came back to Vietnam. Degrees, smart guy, all that kind of stuff. But that experience, was it a person? Was it a something that really changed you?
There are many events that have influenced how my life, I guess, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, I suppose. As I look back in my youth, I can probably think about 2 or 3 events, still have a very vivid memory and influence the way I am today. One of which is when I landed in Connecticut, we live in a pretty poor neighborhood. In that neighborhood, there weren't many white people, mostly Black people and Puerto Ricans. I remember going to school. We walked to school, it's about 5-10 minutes walk to school. I was always bullied. A young Asian kid who didn't understand English, I was always bullied. It shaped the way I am today in a sense that in this world, nothing is fair. Don't expect a world to be fair to you. You will be bullied if you don't take care of yourself. You don't look after yourself. You don't get educated. You don't understand what you have and the values that you bring. You will be bullied. This was in a case of being physically bullied as a kid. But in reality, when it comes to businesses, you will be bullied as a business partner if you don't understand your position. It's an intellectual or economic kind of bullying, but it's one in which you need to be very careful and you need to understand where you are, where you stand, and you need to protect yourself. That's one area that I keep in my mind. And I teach that to my son as well. The world's not fair. You need to know where you are.
Was that instinctive in you, or was it a parent guiding you? Because a lot of kids today in America, and you know this, a lot of kids are going the other direction. They're crying in their milk all the time. Was that instinctive in you?
I don't think it's instinctive. It was, okay, after so many events, you just have to stand up. You can only get beaten up so much. You got to stand up. You got to figure out a way. I was reading a lot of articles at how a lot of people, when they go to prison, similar thing. There's no rules and regulations and laws. You belong to one group or the other, and you have to stand up for yourself. This is how business is done in some respect. There is no instinct. It's no instinct. It's just eventually you have to figure it out that you need to stand up for yourself.
You eventually, after some business and some education, as I just said, you eventually come back to Vietnam. When was your first time back to Vietnam after leaving in 1977?
I wanted to point out one other event that shaped me as well. I was fortunate to join a sports team. I think I joined the first sport team was a soccer team. That is hugely helpful in building characters. It caused me to work with a group of people that not only do I have to contribute, but they also contributed to protecting me as an individual and to win as a team. It also allowed me to excel as an individual within that teamwork. I would encourage any young individuals growing up to participate in team sports. You have your individual sports like tennis and golf, but it's really important to participate in team sports like basketball and football or soccer. These are the activities that allow you to understand what it's like to be part of society today. You can't succeed by yourself. You have to work in an environment that you rely on others and others rely on you. And you have to, again, know the value that you bring into this group. And I think that my family forcing me to play sports in soccer, tennis, and skiing and swimming, it helped a lot in shaping the way I think about how the world and businesses and companies and how teams operate. But don't get me wrong, there has to be a leader. And that leader isn't going to be a good leader without being aggressive. Most teams, if their leader is very soft, isn't leading correctly, the team gets nowhere. But when a team has a good leader that's aggressive, that pushes everyone, that team will get places. And that's the other thing I learned from the teamwork aspect.
And one of the things I've talked about in this podcast a lot, my background, 10 years as a baseball catcher. So I concur with your sports perspective 100%. You spend all the time in the States. You leave Vietnam in 1977. When was your first moment back?
I came back to Vietnam in 2003, early 2003, as a vacation, right after I got out of college. Traveled Asia, a few parts of the world with my friends. One of the areas we visited was Vietnam. I had a chance to stay in Ho Chi Minh City and go to Hanoi and various cities. Back then, I don't know if you remember Shanghai in 1991. I also spent time in Shanghai. Everyone had a bicycle. People dressed in similar clothing, the drabby green color, top and bottom, quite similar in Vietnam. That was my first impression. I guess I was too young to figure out, had I known the growth potential and the potential of the country, gosh, I would have done things a lot more different.
Let me keep you at that first impression coming back. I said 2003 or so. What else did you feel at that moment in time? Did you feel that infectious enthusiasm at that moment too? I would imagine so.
I did, but like I said, I was too young to appreciate what business and commerce meant. Obviously, I saw all the homes that were on the major street fronts. They were renting it out and they were selling goods and services. It didn't translate to me that this place could represent a significant growth opportunity over the next 20 to 30 years. Also, it didn't dawn on me that the entrepreneurial spirit was so strong. And I should have seen that. I mean, everyone was doing commerce. Everyone was selling and buying and importing and selling something. And eventually, instead of importing, they were manufacturing these goods for domestic consumption. I think where I didn't get that feeling was the first time around. But the second time around, I came back with Ernst & Young the second time around. I sort of got that. Things started to click, to understand the motivations, the individuals, the motivation to make money, the motivation to get their children to go and get a good education, to have a foundation for their children and grandchildren to have a more healthy life. Because these individuals that were entrepreneurs in the early 2000s were folks that were extremely poor. They came out of a period where they had nothing. When they were successful, they wanted to build a foundation for their children. And you can see that. That was the passion that drove a lot of these entrepreneurs.
When I first came in 2013, I remember walking with a friend across the bridge from District 1 to District 4, and we were smack dab in the middle of all kinds of commerce. And I remember remarking to her some kind of dumb American joke about Vietnamese government and capitalism. And I was just like amazed because there was merchants everywhere. Everyone was selling. And she just looked at me with, what are you talking about? She it did completely over her head. The American was completely just, wow. Because you don't walk anywhere in America and see that infectious enthusiasm, that selling, that commerce. And you're right, when you see it for the first time, it kind of changes you.
Yeah. The second thing you want to do is, how do I participate in this?
You quickly took that path. Why don't I let you explain how you did end up coming into the country to stay and work, to live?
I think over time, my wife and I, we had to come to a conclusion where with our background and our experience and our education, where is it best that we can add value? We had conversations all the way from, do you really want to be a big fish in a small pond or a fish in a bigger pond in the United States and grow with it? What kind of value will you bring back? What sort of cultural clash will you have? Will the Vietnamese people accept overseas Vietnamese people, particularly those with a Chinese background? All these issues came into our head and we had to think through. And obviously we had to face it when we came back to Vietnam. We had to face every one of these issues when we came back in 2004, 2005 timeframe.
How long did it take you to pick up Vietnamese?
The second time around in 1996, 1997, it took me not too long, about 6 to 12 months. Ironically, it's very similar to Cantonese. Very, very similar. A lot of the words are very much the same, like police. The word police in Vietnamese and the word police in Cantonese is almost exactly the same. So it's not difficult. That's why you see a lot of folks in Hong Kong, when they come to Vietnam, they pick up Vietnamese quite easily. The only difference is the pronunciation. You're a bit off. I'm still a bit off today, for that matter.
I know a lot of CPAs in my life, and a lot of CPAs never make the pivot to go into investment management. So what was the trigger for you? I mean, that is a jump. They're different disciplines. I mean, most people think CPAs, it's a nice gig, it pays consistent money and all that kind of stuff. But you obviously had some risk-taking blood in you that said you wanted to do something a little bit more.
Yeah, I think a combination of a couple of things. One is, like you said, I saw the entrepreneurial spirit in Vietnam. How do I participate? And you're right. A CPA is, I would call it a smart and insecure person, just like really smart consultants. They tend to be very smart and insecure. So how do I move away from that security and move on to risk taking? I talk to a lot of people, and yes, they say the same things that you said. So what pivoted me was actually getting an MBA. Now that's what I tell young people. If you're in the big four and you want to pivot into the investment world, the most easy and logical step to take is to go through and get yourself an MBA. Make sure you get an MBA from a very, very good school. The learning may be the same, but the individuals that you meet there will be leaders of businesses and society throughout the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's the most important thing about going into an MBA program that's prestigious. In short, the MBA program was what helped me pivot it into the investment world.
Let me bring this up to a quick jump to let you give some perspective about where Vietnam is today. Still classified as a frontier market?
If you look at MSCI, they classify Vietnam as a frontier market, and we all want Vietnam to graduate into the emerging market fairly soon. A couple of hurdles, but they're not hard hurdles. They're what they call soft hurdles. Hopefully, the next 2 to 3 years, Vietnam will graduate into the emerging market, which would mean a lot more investors, if they're index benchmarked, will have to participate in the Vietnam market. And that is the hope. That is the hope for a lot of folks that invest in Vietnam, particularly if they invest in a listed asset class.
You know, as somebody who's been here for a decent amount of time, I did not say frontier as a pejorative, just as a kind of an economic classification, a financial classification. Why don't you put some meat on the bones? I think a great example might be, and you're going to know a lot more detail than I, the average individual that's running around America wearing sneakers, Nike, Adidas, etc. Without Vietnam today, they're not running around without those sneakers. I mean, they might make them somewhere else, but Vietnam is mission critical, huh?
Yeah, I think Vietnam is a continuation of what China provided the world in 10, 20 years ago. There's a great book out right now. It's called The Great Demographic Changes. It talks about how the world benefited from the low labor costs that China provided 10, 20 years ago, and why the world didn't face any form of inflation. The huge amount of labor that went into the market from China and Eastern Europe provided goods and services that were kept at a low level for the world. And I think Vietnam is continuing that process simply because the cost of labor in China has gone up quite significantly. And Vietnam's probably about 1/3 out of China today.
1/3 or 1/4?
1/3, roughly, it's the average. The wage in Vietnam is about 1/3 out of China. That helps continue the process of producing the Nikes or the Adidas at a more affordable price, or said differently, not introducing the inflationary impact into some of these goods and services globally. But I suspect, if you read this book, I suspect things aren't going to stay this way for very long for a few reasons. The amount of people in the labor force will start to shrink as the population gets older and older. And places like Vietnam, labor costs will go up because you have a lot of foreign direct investment corporations from South Korea to Europe to America coming to Vietnam and taking advantage of low labor costs. But as you know, that's really a temporary situation. 5, 10 years from now, we do expect labor costs to go up. The key for Vietnam is to introduce higher productivity. How do you become more productive because your labor cost is going to go up? So that means more training, more capital investments in technology or machineries to increase the productivities of individuals to justify the higher labor costs. Otherwise, these corporations will move to Myanmar or Bangladesh. Vietnam's in a sweet spot in the sense that from a labor perspective, I think that's surveyed as the number one, the key item why multinationals come to Vietnam or any other countries around the world when it comes to global expansion is labor costs is one of the key factors. So we do have that advantage today. But like I said, I don't think that advantage will last too long. 5, 10 years from now, our labor costs will go up. And so in order to maintain our competitiveness, we have to be more productive in the years to come.
One thing that's really interesting to me, it's second nature to me, but for, let's say, Americans, the typical American that's never been to Vietnam, maybe they hear you describe Vietnam is still classified as frontier, and you say, okay, the labor costs are 1/3 of China. I think sometimes people get in their mind a little bit of that, well, some poor people 8,000 miles away. What the average American doesn't understand is the competitiveness and the drive of the typical Vietnamese to get education is off the hook. It's not that way in America. It really isn't. And we can see this if we look at the applications to Ivies from all types of Asian students. But why don't you speak to that drive? Because it's almost like Vietnamese know, hey, without this history for the 60s and 70s, if we didn't have that time period, we'd be flying high today. But instead of crying in their milk, they're just like, you know what? Move on, let's make it happen. And everyone just buckles down. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, I agree. But I also think that it's a generational thing. If your parents were wealthy, then will you as the child be as motivated? If you grew up poor and your friends were poor, my sense is you'll be very motivated to get educated. That's one factor. And as you know, The other factor is Asian in general. The Confucian thinking is that children have to be educated. Look at China today. Even the government of China have to admit today that the tutoring program is just way too expensive. They're making all these tutoring businesses go to nonprofit simply because all the parents want their kids to do better, and they pay enormous amount of money for tutoring to get their children better. And that's just an Asian thinking, and Vietnam is no different. Asian parents here will pay quite a bit of money to tutoring programs to get their kids educated. So a combination of the parents pushing their children to be educated, but also the children themselves, as you know, they have to be motivated. I have to admit, I sense that the second, the third, the fourth generation that are coming from families that are well off aren't as motivated as the first generation. I can say that also from an immigration perspective. Those Vietnamese that immigrated to the United States, the first generation, the folks that were born in Vietnam, they work hard. The second generation that were born there, they also work hard somewhat. But the third generation, I would say statistically, they're at the same level of motivation and education as other Americans, whether you're black or white. I just want to say that, look, there are circumstances that your roots, where you come from, what situation you're in, that motivates you to move ahead. So a combination of those two, the parents pushing for higher education and your motivation to learn, is very, very important. I think that generation, and that generation does exist today in Vietnam, but I'm afraid that the next 2 or 3 generations where the children are much more comfortable, that motivation may not be as high as it is right now.
One thing I want to take you back to, I did not bring it up at the beginning, but I want you to paint a picture, your perspective. For a while, after 1975 until 1986, Vietnam was pretty isolated. And especially, I guess, at least until America normalized relations in the early 90s, Vietnam was isolated. That isolation, I guess some people could say it's good, some people could say it's bad, but that isolation was like a unique internal experiment. And especially after 86, why don't you speak to the isolation and how that shaped modern Vietnam? For me, the average person that's here right now, I look around and I say, well, I like everything, but it's an interesting aspect to be walled off and then be doing all this internal drive forward and then all of a sudden open up.
No, you're right. And I think this is why I enjoy spending time speaking with the older generation here, particularly business leaders. They're probably retired by now. They can share with you a lot about what happened between 75 and 85 and 85 and 95 and 95 to 2005. Those were 3 different periods of time where Vietnam had some major, major changes. And then you're in Vietnam, I would encourage you to have that conversation with these older people and they're usually business leaders. You get good information from. But my sense is, I look sort of backward. Why is it that the old the way they do and act the way they do when it comes to running businesses? Well, the younger generations are not. But one of the things I find is that the older generation tend to be less aggressive when it comes to capital structure. They tend to borrow less. They tend to save more. They tend to accumulate more and retain earnings to make the next capital investment, whereas the younger generation are more aggressive to go borrow, to do financial engineering to grow their businesses. So that's one of the key differences I see. And I think it has a lot to do with the time period between perhaps 65 to 75 or even 75 to 85, where there's not a whole lot around available in terms of resources for them to tap into to start businesses and to grow and to have as an individual. When they do have it in the today's, 2010, when they do have that asset or the resources, they tend to be more conservative with how they treat it. So that's one aspect. I'm sure there's other aspects that are quite different and shapes the way these older generations think.
I guess the issue right there too with what you're describing is make money. The only metric was make money. That's how you're funding everything, right? Not funding some other metric. The metric is money.
Yes. I do encourage you to speak to these folks, and they'll tell you why they accumulate gold. In fact, one of the older guys I met with once, he accumulated so much gold that when he passed away, his family couldn't figure out where the golds were. There's obviously a safe and there's gold in the safe, but it was so much so that he had to have pockets around the house. And you put the gold in the house. And in order to find them, you literally have to go buy a metal detector and go around the house and find out where it is. So the question is, why didn't he put the money in the bank? Well, how did the bank operate between 75 and 85? We all know there was a currency exchange and no one liked that. There were a lot of events that shaped the way these people act and run businesses today. And you have to understand that in order to be successful.
Let me take you to, I don't think it's controversial in Vietnam. I just think it's a unique aspect to Vietnam. And you comment about it, female CEOs. You and I have actually talked about this in person. Some of, and people might not be aware of this, but the first billionaire in Vietnam, I believe, was a lady. And I think there's several others. And you probably know them all. You've probably worked with them all. It's a really interesting aspect. Look, I still remember when I first got here, like 2013, I remember walking down the street and there was a bunch of guys doing like a sidewalk project for like some business down in Japantown. I walked by and they were all working hard and everything. And I look over and there's a lady who came up to my waist who was barking orders and had all 10 of these guys moving. She was clearly the boss. Let me let you open up, explain a little bit about this unique part of Vietnamese culture.
Well, you're right. We have been fortunate to have invested in many businesses that are run by women, very, very successful at that matter. And it does beg the question as to why are so many women successful running these businesses? And I've tried to understand this from many aspects. One aspect is look at the numbers, just look at the stats. How do you look at the stats? Well, if you look at the stats and you look at the leadership echelon and you sort of work your way to the management and you work your way to the college educated that got recruited to join the business and you work your way into the college education and high school, how do women stack up these stacks in each of these levels? It turns out that if you look at college education as an example, the number of people that graduate from college, gender-wise, it's 50-50. And we're talking about the top schools from the medical school to the technology school to the economic school. Those are the top schools. The number of graduates, on the average, it's 50-50. So you're allowing men and men to start out on a very balanced, fair starting point. As they move up into the corporations, you can see that, yes, some women do drop off because they have families and blah, blah, blah. But they do come back quite rapidly and continue to move up the echelons of the businesses. And as a result, their ability to join the executive ranks is almost at the same level as men in Vietnam. If you look at places like Europe and the United States, that level of participation drops off quite significantly at the college level, for that matter. If you look at statistics, you can see that the number of men and women graduating from college, the men still are slightly higher. The starting point is at an advantage for men. So we're just looking at just numbers for that matter. And then we look at the qualitative side. What was the qualitative side that helped a lot of these women succeed? I think from the qualitative side, during the war, as you can imagine, a lot of the men didn't make it home. And the women were left with looking after the family, the children, and the financials for the family. And that caused them to be entrepreneur, if you will. You have to be entrepreneur. You're going to bring the bread home. How else are you going to bring the money home? That pushes that generation of people, mostly women, to step up. And the first billionaire happens to be in that group. The first billionaire woman happens to be in that group, and she moved her way up. That generation has obviously retired now, and they are very influential in their children, on their children, particularly in the female side. So that's helped the women move up. The third component we sort of look at is time. How much time do these leaders spend on the things that they do to run the business, to their family life, relative to the personal life? It turns out that when you look at, in general, time, women tend to be a lot more focused. Men tend to be less focused when they become successful. You can count the things that men do. They play golf. They look at real estate. They gamble. They have girlfriends. I'm not saying that women don't have boyfriends. They may do, but it's, living in Vietnam, that for every 10 men that talks about his mistress, you may have one, maybe, that one woman, maybe, talking about her boyfriend. I've never heard of a woman talking about their boyfriend at all, for that matter. So I would assume that the time that the women have, the extra time they have, will probably be dedicated to running the business or running the family, rather than participate in what I call extracurricular activity. That tells me that women tend to be a lot more focused than men. And as a result, they increase their probability of being successful. In the book, I mentioned that I just hate it when a CEO comes to me and brags to me about their golf score. It just begs the question of how much time they spend in the business relative to the time they spend on the golf course. And in Vietnam, to play a round of golf of 18 holes, it takes 5 hours at least.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're a guy that has to invest in businesses. If I'm someone showing up and I'm like, hey, Andy, I need some money. I'm going this direction. Come on, invest in me. Let's talk golf. Your immediate thought is, what the heck is this guy doing? Is he working?
Yes, exactly. It's just a general, we're thinking about that in those aspects. And I don't think I have the right answer yet. I'm still thinking through But it sort of points me in a direction that, hey, the next time I invest in being equal, you got one man running business A and woman running a similar business called B. I would probably lean towards investing in the business that the woman is running.
Again, Vietnam is such a fascinating country, fascinating culture, fascinating, unique aspects. And speaking of fascinating, unique aspects, you can name your book anything. Okay, so you call it Crossing the Street. Well, I think most people, if they've even watched an Anthony Bourdain video, they know why you called it Crossing the Street. I live here. I know why you called it. And I love it because I'm so good at it. It's so second nature. And I'm not saying this is smart, but I can walk into the traffic texting and not even looking at anybody these days. You'll see a tourist come here and it's the stop, start, stop, start. It's really fascinating. Why did you choose that title? It's a sort of metaphor for how you view many aspects of Vietnam.
Yeah, I think my colleague here and Joel and many folks in the firm, we looked at the number of titles. As you can imagine, we sort of brainstormed on the number of titles, but we felt that this one was a good reflection of what it's like to invest in Vietnam. First time around, the second time around, the third time around is fairly difficult. But after you understand what's going on, it becomes a lot easier. And like you said, you can now walk across the street while texting. I can't say I can invest and text at the same time, but certainly a lot easier now relative to 2007, 2008 when we first invested. But I do have the luxury of being in Vietnam for such a long time that the regulations, the rules, how the game is played also have evolved throughout the years. As an investor, we become part of that evolution process. As a result, it's also part of the way that the economy operates, investment operates, and because we've been part of the evolution, it becomes a lot easier as well. So crossing the street is really about, if you try the first time, you just flew off the airplane from New York or London, good luck. If you really want to be successful, grab someone on the ground and hold their hands. Hopefully they can guide you properly. But you know as well as I do, if you pick the wrong person, they'll guide you in the wrong alley. The key is not only crossing the street successfully, but getting the right person to help you cross the street. Otherwise, you'd be going down the wrong alley.
Speak to the idea behind it, though. I think this is really important. It's the flow. Vietnam is all about the flow. Go with the flow. And once you're comfortable with the flow, and once you realize that everybody else is comfortable with the flow, those people on the bikes, those people in the taxis, they're not trying to kill you. I might argue the buses are trying to kill you, but everyone else is not.
Yes, you're right. Going with flow is key. And I think we do have to break this into a couple of components. Going with the flow allows you to enjoy the revenue, enjoy growth of the business. But I have to admit, you have to stop the traffic at times. You have to say, look, this flow isn't working. It isn't sustainable. You have to look at how international business operates. Just to give you an example, ESG. If you go with the flow on environmental and social matter, will never improve society. You have to look at global standards. You have to say, look, these are the local standards, but that has to change. You're going to have to say, look, we have to sacrifice certain types of revenue, certain types of investments, so that we can take the business to a different level as it relates to ESG matter. That's just one example. In short, yes, we do have to go with the flow, but I have to admit, you have to step back at certain times and say, look, the flow isn't working. It isn't sustainable. We have to make changes so that we are in line with international standards and international practices.
So this is kind of a shop question. You guys are a multi-billion-dollar company, multi-billions US under management. You were just talking a second ago about the evolution, your company growing with Vietnam and the evolution of how things have taken place. Was that kind of a warning shot to those would-be entrepreneurs out there that say, hey, I got my billion, I'm coming to Vietnam to set up shop and start throwing my money around? It's a little more difficult than that, isn't it?
It is difficult. Aside from reading my book, I would also encourage someone to read the book, Mr. China. I've told you about this book already. It's a great book about investing in China, how many ways you can lose money. Vietnam is not too different. You're coming off the airplane with $1 billion. If you don't know what you're doing, you are going to lose money. Participating evolution process, it helps drive the way we want the standards to be. And we want the standards to be more international. Just to give you an example at the moment, we are trying to help with the issuance of corporate bonds. We want more corporations to issue bonds and have the bonds listed on the stock market. But the problem with issuing corporate bonds is you have to have a credit rating agency, you have to have an underwriting process, and you have to create liquidity for the trading of the bonds. So all this have to be put in place. So this is part of the evolution of the capital market as it relates to the debt side. Well, we want to be part of that. We want to say, okay, how should we help the government develop the issuance of corporate bonds, fixed income products to make it successful 5-10 years from now so that corporations will have many ways, another path, I would say another route in terms of raising capital, and participating in the development of the rules and regulation is how we participate in the evolution of this process.
I do not have expertise in where I'm going to go right now, but I'm guessing, given your longevity and given the progress of Vietnam, you and other peers like yourself have had a chance to work closely with the government in positive ways on, for example, something like the issuance of corporate bonds. Would that be a fair statement? I mean, it's not just government keeping hedge funds and venture capital funds at arm's distance. There has been a good give and take and a good dialogue over the years.
Yes, most definitely. I remember the first time I worked with the Ministry of Finance and the State Security Commission was the development of the listed funds in 2005, 2006. When I was with Prudential, there was no concept of having a fund in Vietnam, zero. So the first product they put in place was a fund that allowed people to invest in, and that fund would invest in many, many companies, mostly listed, if you will, and listed companies and the government bonds. But that fund was also itself listed on the stock market. The struggle that the folks had to come through was, is it going to be an open-ended fund or a closed-ended fund? So if you list the fund, open-ended, because if an investor wanted to get out, they would just sell the shares. If the investor wanted to come in, they just buy the shares. That's the nature of listed funds. That was my first interaction with the regulators in helping them develop the rules and regulations of having a listed on the stock market, like a Berkshire Hathaway or our fund is listed on the London Stock Exchange. Over time, what happened was these funds started trading at a huge discount. And then the regulators and the investors, well, why don't we have open-ended funds, what we know as mutual funds? We have redemptions and subscriptions, and that's what we have today. And then after that, they introduced ETFs, and that's what we have today. So in the evolutions of financial instruments and products that are coming, we will now touch upon derivative products. We have 2 derivative products, and we'll probably have a handful more in the coming years. This is how we become part of the evolution of financial products and various ways for businesses to raise money.
One of the phrases or the name of a video game in your book really struck me. I'd not heard anybody else use it, perhaps just because I've not been around enough, but SimCity. And in many ways, that's what we've been talking about this whole conversation is post the war, post the 10 years after the war, and then Vietnam putting policies in place in 1986. It was almost like just fill in the blanks. I mean, all the things that one would know that would have to come into what would become a developing country were going to come. Now, maybe with the unique Vietnamese spin, but many of these things were still going to come. And so the phrase SimCity is really a great way to think about it.
Yeah, I love that game. In that game, the side effect, there's only a few of them. As you can imagine, in a country like Vietnam, the side effect is massive. The side effects, the secondary effect, the tertiary effect. In the game, there's only a few of them. Pollutions and money being spent and stuff like that. But in society, you have so much other things to think about. The game is just a game, but I have to admit, it is a starting point for me to think about how the economy and the society develop. But you have to admit, the government has a lot more on their hands when it comes to making policies because the side effects, the secondary effect, the tertiary effect is massive. You can see it right now in COVID. How they come up with certain regulations have secondary and tertiary effect immediately. They constantly have to think about, okay, if I did this, what would the citizen do? Oh, I got to be 2 or 3 steps ahead of them. To me, society is a lot more complicated than SimCity, but it does give me a good basis to allow people to think about, hey, what Vietnam is like.
You bring up COVID. I was hesitant to bring it up because I think, I've got a lot of friends that want to talk about COVID in Vietnam. All it takes is a few clicks and we can find out what COVID is doing in Florida or Myanmar or Indonesia or India. And I don't think there's anyone that has a great prescription yet for how to handle it. So I'm really hesitant to try to judge any one country at this moment in time. I think it's terribly unfair, really.
Every country is treating COVID differently. We get this question a lot from our investors pretty much every week. If you will, how is Vietnam doing and how is it treating the pandemic? And in general, I think our response is very simple. Vietnam does practice identification, isolation, and communication very well. And they identify those that are F0, 1, 2, and 3, and they isolate those that are needed. And they communicate, they consistently communicate with society as to what to do. Unfortunately, with the Delta variant, the infection rate is quite high. And the ability to test and figure out those that have it is low because they don't show symptoms. A lot of people simply don't show symptoms and they become infectious. So it is an unfortunate situation that we are in today, but hopefully in the coming 2 or 3 weeks, we'll peak out and we'll reduce the number of cases and Vietnam will open up again. If you look at the stock market, the market does reflect the fact that Vietnam will get through this period. The market hasn't crashed. In fact, every opportunity that it drops, people would buy into it and take advantage of the drop. I think investors, you know that today, 95% of the participants, if you will, 90 to 90% of the participants are domestic. They're the people who live in Vietnam. And they are very optimistic about the situation. And they are putting money where their optimism is. They're supporting the stock market, which is very positive. Now we just need to make sure that the vaccine gets rolled out effectively and pervasively into the economy, can control this viral infection.
When this passes, I wish there was a way that we could film it. Like maybe it's just a 10-minute film or something, a documentary, but the energy and enthusiasm that when this passes in Vietnam, and I'm sure it'll be energetic in other countries too, but I know this particular country, I think the enthusiasm will be quite amazing.
Look, this is the fourth wave. Remember what happened after wave 1, 2, and 3? They packed the beaches.
Yeah.
It was so bad in some of these vacation spots that the government afterwards said, look, stop going. It becomes a hotspot after that. People have money that they want to spend, and they're happy to spend. And obviously, they can't travel abroad, so they went all the vacation hotspot. So you know they're going to spend the money.
Let's talk about demographics for a moment. I think it's one of the most amazing things about Vietnam. Correct me if I'm wrong. I thought I had the stat a little bit wrong before I saw your book. Is it 2/3 of the country is under the age of 35 in a country of 100 million?
As time goes by, we looked at 35, it used to be 30. And I think we're saying roughly 60 to 65% of the population is under the age of 35. This is important because it looks at the value creation relative to value extraction of the society. If you look at China today, the population whereby they're taking more from society than giving back to society. And it's going to be more costly for the population. That's why one of the key issues in China right now is to encourage multiple children in the family. So in Vietnam at the moment, we believe that the young generation is a dominant component and they're going to get wealthier and wealthier. And that drives the way we look at investments. Do we invest in pharmaceutical that will cater to the older generation, or do we invest in social media types of businesses where the younger generation are getting wealthier and wealthier? They will be using more and more of this technology stuff. So there's a balance of thinking about these issues when it comes up.
I don't know the exact demographics of the states, but Vietnam, as a country of approximately 100 million people, approximately 60 to 65 million under the age of 35, that's an amazing power, because ultimately, I think when anyone looks at demographic studies, sometimes it doesn't even make a difference. Of course, it makes a difference, but just speaking hypothetically, what's the educational level, et cetera? The youth wins when it comes to the demographics.
That's an important thing. We also looked at education. First of all, how do you define education? And I think we said, look, something along the lines of, if you have a high school education of about 10th or 11th grade and above, you're considered in this block of education. And they said roughly over 90%, I don't have the figure in front of me, but over 90% of the population above 16, 17 years old are educated. That means they have at least a high school 10 or 11th grade education, which is important because when FDI comes to Vietnam, foreign direct investment comes to Vietnam, and the factories open, they need to be able to hire people that at least can read and write so that they can train them on how to use machinery and equipment. It's a foundation for further training to address the point I raised earlier, productivity. You can't increase productivity without training. But in order to have training, you have to have a basic knowledge of reading and writing and mathematics. And that's what the bulk of the younger populations have. I think that's key. This is one of the key components that we raise with the government is you have to invest in training as well as infrastructure. You have to invest in training, and that will increase the productivity of your population because sooner or later, your labor costs will become a disadvantage in Vietnam.
One last thought. I didn't bring this up. Sometimes I'll go to the track over off MICHAEL at Wallu Stadium, and sometimes young guys will come up to me, and they want to talk. And sometimes English is hit or miss. But I always tell them, I say, guys, if you guys master some English to go along with Vietnamese, your country's going to be unstoppable.
I think you're right. I think most of the younger generation will completely agree with you. Remember, before that generation, the younger generation learned English, the generation before that learned Russian. And the generation before that learned French. Vietnam has been very, very used to having a secondary language. Everyone speaks a secondary language, whether it's French, Russian, Chinese, or English. Being someone that speaks English and English being a predominant language of business, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to tell these younger folks that you're going to have to learn English because Facebook is written in English. Google is written in English. Apple is written in English. But you have to admit, you have the 10 cents and you have the Alibaba coming up very, very quickly, and China will be a dominant player. It isn't way off for a lot of people in the younger generation think.
3 languages, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, I told my son, the 3 languages you need to speak in the world is Spanish, Mandarin, and English.
Why Spanish?
You cover the globe. You cover the globe if you speak Spanish, English, and Chinese. I think Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world after Chinese in terms of population. Geography-wise, you cover the world. Being Vietnamese, you have to speak Vietnamese. But I do encourage him, and he learned Spanish, and he obviously speaks English. So he's 2/3 of the way there. But it's an important part of the world today that we live in. It's getting smaller and smaller.
I did not mention it today, though, but the book I'm holding in my hand, Crossing the Street, How to Make a Success of Investing in Vietnam. This is a pretty practical guide. So there's some nitty gritty in here. As I talking to the former CPA, I've taken you on the tour today, but for people that want to get into some detail, definitely check the book out, Crossing the Street. Andy, is there anything that I've not brought up today that you really wanted to talk about? Anything you wanted to address?
I'm a big promoter of Vietnam. And I think, if anything, from this conversation and from reading the book, I want to encourage people to at least do some research, study about Vietnam. There's a lot of noise and discussions about Vietnam and its great potential. And I think it's there. And I want to welcome folks to come to Vietnam to invest, whether it's financial investments or direct investments. But I want people to invest safely. It's like coming to Vietnam for a vacation and you didn't enjoy your vacation because the service is bad. It's beautiful. The building is beautiful, but the service is bad. I don't want them to face that. In order for them to enjoy their experience and be successful at it, I want them to do research. Think about the issues in advance before you come to Vietnam, because it's still a frontier/emerging market. You will have these challenges. Read the book, research, talk to other people in advance of your trip to Vietnam, and that becomes more enjoyable and more successful.
If people want to check you and your firm out, that would be VinaCapital?
Yes, VinaCapital.com is where you can find us on the internet.
Cool. Andy, thank you very much. And when this all passes, we will grab a lunch one day soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.